evening. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health. I'm Nels Kloster, and I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. Good evening.
Right. And just to remind people to contact us with questions, you can visit us at our Facebook site at facebook.com/letstalkvt, or you can email us at questions@letstalkvt.com.
And as you know, sometimes we like to have guests on our show from time to time. And so last week when we were finishing up, we had a couple of questions around spirituality and psychosis and stuff. And I said that we wanted to talk more about that. And so we are going to address that, and that's the next week. We're going to be talking a little bit more about what those last questions were. We had already scheduled this one, and we are so happy to have her. And this is Susie Walker, who is director of the local Turning Point Recovery Center. Welcome to our show.
Welcome,
Thank you. Thank you both for having me here. I'm excited to talk to you tonight. And I'm the Turning Point of Windham County Executive Director. We're a peer recovery center for people in recovery from addictions. Peer recovery means that we don't have counselors and therapists. We have people in recovery and people who are supportive of the recovery process, who volunteer and help us support our guests in recovery so that they can live, happy, healthy lives in recovery and try to minimize or avoid the cycle of relapse that happens sometimes.
Now, if you could say a little bit about almost two different populations. One would be people who are currently using, and they're out there and they're sort of stuck on that crazy world of getting high and wanting to stop, getting high and wanting to stop. And that's both alcohol and drugs. And also the other population would be people who are gone to treatment or been in treatment or been part of the Department of Corrections, who are really, coming out looking to start a new way of life. And
Sure.
I know that you guys deal with both those populations. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Sure. We deal mostly with the population of people who are coming out of the correction system or who are coming out of the treatment system. We have very strong relationships with the Brattleboro Retreat, particularly the Starting Now outpatient program, and with Habit APCO. We go and do presentations, and we actually carry peer recovery groups into the facilities, so people don't just hear about what peer recovery is and hear about the Turning Point Recovery Center. They get to experience what peer recovery support feels like, and our hope is that then it will be easier for them to actually come visit the center once they are out of their program. So we get a lot of referrals from the retreat and Habit APCO and HCRS and the corrections system. I'm an almost full-time director, and I have a part-time volunteer coordinator. And everybody else at the center who's there to support our guests are volunteers. They may be volunteers who are people in recovery who want to give back. They may be people in the corrections system who need to do some community service requirements, people in the connected with Department of Labor. And if they're getting transitional support of some kind, they may have to do community service as well. So we get a lot of placements from those places, and Voc Rehab and Weber, people who are having work experiences may be placed at Turning Point because they have personal issues or family issues. And so if they're working with somebody, a caseworker or someone who says, this supportive environment would be good for you, then they refer them to Turning Point to have that work experience and to also get peer support while they're getting their volunteer time.
Now, you were talking about earlier today, you were meeting with some folks, and why don't you speak a little bit about that, because that sounded really interesting.
Sure, it was wonderful. Today I was presenting to the Physicians Education Group, which I guess is a group that meets every Monday. And so they have different training, and they have different speakers come in and present to them. So today I got to talk about peer recovery supports and Turning Point of Windham County, our recovery coaching programs, and the different groups that we have available to help people in recovery. We know a good number of our guests go to treatment and are referred to us through that, but we also have a lot of people who come to us who have never been to treatment or who are waiting to get into treatment because of waiting lists or insurance issues or whatever the case may be. So we provide an environment where those people can feel safe until they get to treatment, or maybe they end up not going that route for whatever reasons. So I got to speak to the doctors who see these patients in a lot of different situations. A couple of weeks ago, we did some presentations for the emergency department, and they often see people before they're really ready to get help. So we'd like to help whoever we can help, but sometimes people just aren't ready for that change. So we're available to help the people who've already made that decision, whether they may be having some trouble with relapse or not. But there are other people in the community who just aren't there yet, and we can just hope that we can keep building our programs and helping people get into recovery so that there are more of us to help them when they're ready.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, the medical community is kind of a confrontational sort of encounter for them. I mean, they're in the emergency department for whatever it needs, because there are a lot of medical issues associated with addiction, but it's not often seen as a compassionate place for them. I think often there's that animosity where they're going to treat me like an addict, and they're trying to take advantage, and the medical community thinking, well, they're trying to take advantage of me and just sort of get drugs from me. So it's always difficult. I try to encourage the people that I work with to realize that it's really in their best interest to be open about sort of their treatment, whether it's methadone or Suboxone, that nothing worse happens to them when they're there. But I'm encouraged that they actually wanted you to come there.
Yeah.
They're seeing that there's a need or this conflict going on, and so I'm really curious what the conversation was like that you had with the physicians.
Well, I had more of a conversation with the emergency department folks a couple weeks ago. Today was more of a presentation, and they did have some questions. But in the ER, as you might imagine, people show up, and as one of the workers said, they may come in with a broken ankle. So clearly, they have a need for pain meds. But then you see them in a few months, and you just have a pretty strong suspicion they're not there really for that kind of pain. They're trying to work you to get medication. And the other thing that they struggle with in the emergency department is that when people are ready, they've made the decision, they are ready to get some kind of help for their addiction, they don't know what to do, so they go to the emergency room. And the emergency room isn't set up to deal with that. And so it's not as urgent a matter as this person over here bleeding or having other issues. So they have to wait. And even though the staff tries to help them, if you have to wait for 2 or 3 hours, your desire to want to stick around and get help gets less and less the more uncomfortable you get, because you don't have access to that, whatever it is that's been giving you relief. So we just had a pretty open conversation, and they tried to get some understanding about, what that addict might be feeling when they come to the emergency room. There is so much stigma attached still to mental illness and addiction that sometimes people don't want to identify that way. I'm here for this other issue, so I don't need to disclose that. And then in other cases, people who are in long-term recovery learn how to advocate for themselves so that they can tell the doctor or the dentist or whoever that, no, I don't want that kind of medicine, because that could be a slippery slope for me. And so there's a lot that we can all learn from each other about how they can support us better, and how we can help people who are in recovery to know that if you're about to we see happen a lot actually, relapse when people have to have dental work or they've had an accident of some kind. And so when a doctor prescribes you a medicine, it feels safe and you're hurt, so you take it without really understanding that because you're an addict, that might have some complications that you haven't anticipated.
One of the things that I like about the turning points that I know is that you're not, the ticket for coming in doesn't mean that you have to be in abstinence. That you can actually be struggling with it, or trying to get better, trying to stop. And my hope is in some ways it would allow people who have maybe been to treatment but relapsed, but gives them a place to go and maybe start that process over again. And obviously you've had some work with that. I mean, do you have like relapse groups, or do you talk to people about that? Or?
Sure. At the Turning Point Recovery Centers, I don't think I said that we're one of 11 recovery centers in the state of Vermont, and we all work together through the Vermont Recovery Network. And for all of us, being a safe, supportive environment for me, it's the number one thing, because if it's a safe environment, then you can come in and you're more likely to stick around. Part of it being safe means that we're a zero tolerance policy, environment. If someone comes in and they've only just used, maybe they smell of alcohol or marijuana, we can help them find another place to be, but they can't stay at the center because that can be triggering for the folks who are there in recovery. So while it's true what you say is that people struggle with addiction, so we may see somebody who's a regular guest at the center over months or weeks, and then over a weekend maybe they've had a slip. Mm-hmm. They can come back in and say, I messed up, what do I do? And so they can talk to coaches or other guests or volunteers to figure out, was there a sequence of events that happened? Because we often hear that you might have slipped on Saturday, but that relapse started happening days or weeks or whatever, some period of time before then. So we want people to always feel welcome to be able to come back in and know there's no judgment. If you've had a slip, we want to know how we can help you avoid it in the future, and is there anything we can do to help you right now, whether it's maybe you need to go back to detox and treatment. Maybe it would help you to work with a recovery coach. Maybe we can find you a different group to participate in.
And I know that one of the things that Nels and I did, I guess last year, we went out and did a talk in White River Junction for coaches for people on medication-assisted recovery.
Oh, the pathway guides probably.
Right,
Yeah.
right, remember that?
For people on methadone
Yep.
or Suboxone.
Yep.
And so you have folks like that coming in and being part of the recovery? Is that a welcoming place for them? Or?
It is, absolutely. I mentioned the network a minute ago. Almost a year ago, a little over a year ago, the Vermont Recovery Network itself received a SAMHSA grant to be able to provide peer recovery support to people who are in recovery, who are in medication-assisted recovery, whether that's methadone or Suboxone, whatever it is. And that grant allowed each of the 11 centers to have a part-time person in their center who is working directly with that population. So currently at our Turning Point, we have a medication-assisted recovery group, and we have this pathway guide that's available to work one-on-one with people who are in medication-assisted recovery. Sometimes we hear from them that they don't feel welcome in the 12-step world because they're not abstinent. So they'll hear from people, well, you're taking medication, so you're not really in recovery. Or, they need to talk about things that aren't appropriate to bring up in the 12-step world. And so by having this medication-assisted recovery support group, they can talk about what they need to talk about. It's a safe environment, and they determine what's suitable for that group. We have various kinds of support groups like that. So one I hope to have again is called Double Trouble. And it's if you've got addiction and alcoholism issues and you've got another diagnosis that you're dealing with in your life.
Or depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder.
Right, that you can go to this group and you can talk about either thing. Whereas in some groups, you might get a little pushback about talking about certain topics in the context of that group. So,
I'm a little bit acquainted with some of that, but the Double Trouble, I've never liked that title. I'd rather call it Double Blessing if you want.
I understand it. I agree completely. Yeah.
But one of the things, and I was hoping you could, you also are the chairman, right, of the statewide organization. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the funding. I mean, just,
sure.
Without getting into but how does it fund it, and what does it look like throughout the state? I mean, is there a big difference, or?
No, let's see. We get funded through, our funding comes to us through the ADAP, Alcohol Drug Abuse Program, through the Agency of Human Services. So they oversee our grant, and they, they help us make it a uniform recovery system rather than 11 little independent islands of recovery. So as a network, we all get together every 6 weeks to share best practices and talk about how to advocate for our needs, talk about new and emerging issues that are coming up. And out of this, we got the Pathway Guide grant I just mentioned. And we also just got another SAMHSA grant so that we can build the infrastructure of the network itself. Until a year ago, we had 1 part-time network employee. As of right now, we have 4 network employees. So we've grown a lot in just the last couple of years as a network. The funding is, I've been the director of our center for about 5 years. And when I started, we were getting $55,000 a year. And that's by the time you pay your rent or your mortgage, whatever your situation, all your bills, the insurance you have to have. You only have a little bit left for staffing. And because we're mostly volunteer run, that works to a point. But if we really wanted to go to the next level and be a more robust partner with our treatment providers and the state, we needed more staffing to make this thing really work. And so we've been granted additional funding the last couple of years, and every time we get an increase, it's been institutionalized. So for our center, we've gone from 55,000 to 95,000, which means that we can have more hours of staffing to support our volunteer team to provide more and more programs.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, because one of the things I really like about the Turning Point is it seems rather sort of a mixed approach, a very eclectic approach, because when you look at, say, medication-assisted therapy, and people are considering that, well, you know, methadone or Suboxone by itself is very powerful, or like you were saying with the 12 steps, or AA or NA, it's like, you know, abstinence, you know, no medications whatsoever. But then people step back and take a broader recovery approach. And I think William White is someone who's written a lot on this topic. They really, the quality of your life is really what matters as far as defining your recovery. And it's almost like we see this in sort of psychiatry outside of addiction, that there are people who are very dedicated to psychoanalysis, they're very dedicated to cognitive behavioral therapy, they're very dedicated to sort of the assumed power of pharmaceuticals. But most people who are on the ground dealing with people directly, they don't sort of belong to such one line of thought or one school of thought. They use a sort of like eclectic sort of mishmash. And it sounds like, you know, you're very much, you know, treatment is such a short period of time. You know, your AA meeting is once an hour a week, or, you know, many times a week. You're at the methadone clinic, you know, in the morning and you're gone. At least many, many hours open. So it sounds like you're more sort of, I'm almost say more a part of their life, say, than the various treatment providers are.
Well, yeah, because treatment can be very, you know, it's an event, or maybe you go back weekly for a while. But what we do, what we know about recovery is it's a lifelong process. And that process starts with stopping the behavior or the substance that's been interfering with your wellness and your life. But it's only the beginning. And so what we help people with is they've stopped doing the drink or the alcohol. And our coaches, for instance, might meet one-on-one with someone, and we look at all of the aspects of the person's life. What is going on in that person's life that if we don't tend to it, it'll put their recovery at risk? Well, housing is a big one. We know that people need safe, stable housing. So if you're currently living with a roommate who's still using or who's dealing, that is going to put your recovery at risk at some point. You might be feeling rock solid in your recovery right now, but if you have a bad day next week and there's something right there for you to provide you relief, that might be a relapse waiting to happen. Same thing with employment. You know, we see a lot of people who, maybe had a great career as a bartender, but that's not such a hot idea anymore. And, maybe you had a career path and you were in school studying for something, and somewhere along the way, your journey was interrupted. And so your coach might work with you and say, well, what is it you were studying? What was your passion in life? What did you really want to pursue? And then that might lead to getting connected with school again, or finding a job to see if that field is still something that would work for you. there's so many things, medical and dental. We find that people haven't been to a doctor or a dentist in years or even decades, because when the disease of addiction takes hold, those things just aren't important. And so we just help people to look at everything in their life, and the school and employment, the spirituality, wellness, if things like meditation and yoga could be useful in their recovery lifestyle. It's a whole lifestyle. It's not just an event that you can graduate from.
And that, that's wonderful. And I mean that, it really is. And one of the things, like a couple of years ago, when Governor Sunland said, we got this heroin state address and everything, and I was glad he did. Put a spotlight on it. It's true. And when I was working at the hospital setting, we had Vermonters from every little hamlet in the state. I mean, it wasn't just Burlington, it wasn't just one city, it was everywhere. And many of them would, like you say, they would go to meetings, perhaps, they would, go see a doctor, they would get medicine or something. But when you're involved with drugs and alcohol, but it's sort of a lifestyle almost, I mean, quite frankly. And I've always thought that recovery, it has to be, if using was a lifestyle, then recovery has to be a lifestyle. I mean, you can't just say, and the other thing is that you can't live your life to not do something.
Right.
You can not do something to have a life. And I think for a lot of people, at least some of the ones I've worked with, and by the time they're in the hospital, they're in trouble. It seems almost hopeless. I mean, it seems like there's so many other things wrong. I owe money, my family's upset with me, I got legal problems, I got medical. I mean, it isn't just like, gee, I can't do drugs anymore. Listen, that's the one thing I can do.
Right.
It's everything else I can't do anymore. And I've always felt that, when the recovery centers were starting up and people were talking about it, it just seemed like such a good idea. It really did. It seemed like, well, this is what is needed. Is that kind of continuous support, develop a new lifestyle, a new way of living. And have you had that opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of wreckage that happens when people are in addiction, active addiction, and especially if that's been for some period of time. And so we have seen people who get clean and sober, and they don't have a job, they don't have a car to get to a job if they had one, their relationships are in trouble, and there's a lot, and it can be overwhelming, and then relapse happens because it's very painful. But if you're working with a recovery coach, or you're spending time at the center and building a community of people, then you can say, okay, let's start here. Let's start with the housing. If I've got a safe place to be, then that can lead to the next step. So let's take all of these areas one at a time and slowly put my life back together.
And you could be continuing, like, struggling with abstinence, maybe, even,
Possibly,
still trying to get it together, trying to make it all work. I know I've worked with people who had multiple drugs, and they might get rid of coke, and they might get rid of heroin, get on Suboxone, and still mess around with pot, or still struggle with food, I mean, it's a process. It's a process that, takes time.
It is, and some people just quit everything. And other people do kind of let go of one thing at a time, as you described.
Yeah.
So, and hopefully they're experiencing enough reward in that new lifestyle in recovery that maybe as they are letting go of other things, it becomes, I don't ever want to say it's easy, but it comes more appealing to them.
Now, do you have family members come in and talk to you, or is that something that happens? And and where does your volunteers come from? Who makes a good volunteer?
We say that you're in recovery if you say you're in recovery, whatever path of recovery you're on, and that also includes family members and other people. We know that our family and our friends and our employers and our coworkers, addiction affects everyone around us. So we do have groups like Al-Anon for people.
Right at the center, at the turning point?
Right at the center. And we also, our volunteers might be people who are not in personal recovery, but they have a family member or friend or somebody in their life. Their life has been affected by somebody else's addiction. And those folks like to support us as well. And what was the second part of your
Like your volunteers,
Yeah, so our volunteers come from, they might be people in recovery who just want to give back in some way. They might be people, family members of people in recovery. We also get people who are doing community service requirements for one reason or another. We get people who've been in active addiction for a while, might have spotty work histories. So we get people referred to us through the Department of Labor programs where they can get a work experience for some number of, usually about 3 months. And they can have the experience of showing up on time and doing certain things. Sometimes just being reacquainted with what's appropriate to do and say and wear in the workplace. So the volunteer program itself is a peer recovery support because it's providing people that opportunity to have a work experience and to just learn what it's like to have responsibilities. And those people, one of my favorite things to do is to be able to write a letter to say, Robert works and plays well with others, and he shows up on time.
Could I get that?
Sure.
No, you can't write that letter. Well, I'm thinking too, as we're talking about this, that there's a lot of sort of a public face for addiction now. That there's been this notion that being anonymous really sort of continues the stigma around addiction. And a lot of people in the 12 steps are sort of struggling with that, but there's been more of a movement towards sort of coming out, if you will.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much Turning Point plays a role in that, or what the approach or attitudes are with that
Sure.
sort
Thank
of
you for asking.
public face versus being anonymous.
There's a movie called The Anonymous People that talks a lot about this idea of a stigma, that there's still so much stigma attached to addiction and mental health too, that it really is hurting the recovery movement, because we hear about all the negative aspects of addiction and alcoholism. We hear about the crime, we hear about all, the ER visits and the trouble in the community. And when people get into recovery, it's like whoosh, they vanish. They become invisible because they're all saying it's an anonymous thing. So what we're trying to do more of is put a face on recovery. And to put a face, in our case, put a face on Turning Point, the more people, like on our staff and our coaches, the people see out in the community, they say, oh, that's Turning Point. That's so-and-so that works down at Turning Point. So it makes recovery a little more accessible.
Now, many years ago, I was up in Montpelier. There's a college about a couple blocks away from downtown, and it was a mental health conference. And I just want to say this very quickly. It was the first time I heard people in the mental health, consumers, if you will, talk about being in recovery.
Oh, cool.
And they talked about how much they liked that idea. They were like, alcoholics and addicts, they could be in recovery.
Yeah.
How come we can't be in recovery? You know what I mean? And they really took to it. I mean, it's and I'm glad that you mentioned it. There is a place for mental health for people with mental illness in the recovery centers. All right, so we're coming to a close now at this point, and I just wondered if you have any message or anything that you'd like to say to the Brattleboro community, to people in the state about it.
Well, thank you again for having me here. I didn't mention, I don't think, that our recovery center had moved outside of downtown about 3 years ago, and we are about 2 weeks away from moving back to the downtown Brattleboro area. So we'll be at 39 Elm Street in a couple weeks. If you want to hoist some boxes and help us unpack, please call the center, 257-5600, or stop on by. We love giving tours of the new place because we know from our previous experience downtown that we'll be more accessible to people in recovery by being in the back in the downtown area. So thanks again for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
And how about the rest of the state? I mean, I know Bennington's on Main Street. Are most of the recovery centers easily accessible?
Most of the centers are close to the heart of the downtown area where they are.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to be able to walk there.
Yeah.
Right.
A really important
Right.
piece of this.
Right.
Thank you again for coming on.
You bet. Thank you.
It's been great.
Yeah, Susie, thank you.